Hey everybody, and welcome to another real estate series video. I'm John VanDuzer, CPA and partner with James Moore and Company. I'm joined today by Phil Kabler, who's an attorney and partner with Bogin, Munns Munns. Phil specializes in real estate, business, banking, and a touch of the equine industry. And in addition to being a good friend of mine, he also is a professor at UF and is president of the local bar association. Thank you, Phil, for joining us.
I don't know if there's anything further to say. We could just stop right here, John. Um, One of the things as we get rolling into this is, and you and I have talked about this offline, John, is when I intake clients in any of those areas, whether it's real estate, business, banking, anything, I have a series of intake questions like I'm sure you do. But question number one always for me is, do you have a CPA? Because I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express, but I play very nicely with CPAs. And one of my goals for any kind of deal, real estate, business, anything, is that we don't come up with a deal structure trying to limit liability or attend to the various wants and needs of the parties and end up with an undesirable tax consequence. So John can attest to this. We've done forming LLCs, for example, for mutual clients over time. And I send my draft to John with the client's permission. And, he comments, we go back and forth a little bit. And actually, I've incorporated some of John's comments into the LLC operating agreement because, again, the goal is to make it work for the clients overall. So back to real estate.
Yeah. So we've been doing these videos over the past several weeks. So check out our YouTube channel and you can kind of catch up on all of our videos. But wanted to get with Phil and really start looking at the legal aspects, particularly with how the real estate industry, like many other industries, has evolved with COVID and kind of the ongoing pandemic. So kind of just to dive right in, I figure the first area we could talk about is commercial real estate sales. So Phil, as you're working deals with your clients, could you give us kind of a ballpark? What percentage of transactions that were kind of in the hopper as of March went through, and which ones kind of fell through?
Well, for mine, they've gone through. So, but I think that probably goes to the underlying point is what makes it that causes a transaction to go all the way from contract to closing, particularly in a challenged environment like this one. And so I write blogs too. John knows this. And I spend a tremendous amount of focus, and I do it when I'm wearing my professor hat as well. But in my blogs, I talk a lot about proactive risk management. And my point there is that it's better and it's easier to try to work through issues up front as opposed to having to clean them up later. And not my book, didn't write it, don't get anything, but for my students and clients, if you can see it, here's a book called The Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande. And it really, I heard about it on a radio interview with the guy, just happenstance, and I bought a copy, and we were at one of the commercial real estate retreats that they used to have in the summer, and I read it all in one sitting, and it affected me quite a bit because it goes to proactive risk management and the use of checklists to avoid problems, which goes to my point. We start off with a good contract. When we start off with a good, well-formed, well-negotiated contract between buyer, seller, and with an eye towards the lender and insurance, it makes the deal flow, that particular deal flow through due diligence, much smoother. Not that you don't end up with off-ramps occasionally on due diligence that have to be addressed, particularly with larger or historical or vacant land properties, but we get to the contract. We spend a good deal of time, if we're a buyer, or accommodating if we're a seller, on due diligence, and that means physical structure due diligence, vacant land due diligence, financial due diligence, potential liability due diligence, the entities involved with doing it. And then from there, it just gets a lot easier once we get to closing it, going from contract pre-due diligence to doing the documents and then sitting down at the closing table, which doesn't really happen a whole lot. That's absolutely an effect of COVID. I actually did a personal real estate closing in the backyard of the closing closing agent outside. So we're seeing that occur. Or our firm, when we do occasionally, we do inside ones, everyone's sitting far apart. But I am seeing as well more mailaways right now.
Yeah, and we've seen a bit of that too. So that's interesting. So what I'm hearing is the deals that you saw going into March and kind of through the COVID were so well put together that by the time they got kind of through that, they weren't derailed by this pandemic, which is great.
Well, it's worth spending the time up front.
Yeah. Now, kind of having that same eye toward having a good contract since COVID, what sort of changes to provisions and purchase agreements have you seen?
Well, I'm gonna lap over to two areas actually, because it's gonna apply to purchase and sales as well as commercial leases.
Yeah.
And that's the contingencies. The contingencies, that's all the way across, by the way, that even residential transactions, the contingencies and the covenants that are tied to them. Inspections are a little bit more complex, arranging them because of social distancing and such. Timing is a little bit more challenging. Banks and lenders, they're getting back to working out of their offices, but for quite a while we were doing closings where the bankers were at home. And so that's the kind of hitches that we've seen. So how does it play out in the contracts? I would say it's in the contingencies. And one of the big ones, since I know you're going to ask about it anyways, is force majeure. And it's insurance partner, business interruption insurance. Force majeure is a clause that most people, it was so-called boilerplate, fine print. Most people didn't really think about it much. It's the so-called act of God provision. It just says that if something out of the party's control arises, and it can get much more complicated than that, and you can look towards my blogs, and I did a whole article about it. But if something falls out of the party's reasonable control, doesn't cancel the transaction, it suspends it until that issue has been resolved. So COVID, go ahead.
So I was going to say, in 2019, if you could rewind time and think about your interpretation of force majeure, is if I own a shopping center and an asteroid falls out of the sky and blows up the shopping center, then I, as the landlord, for some time being, until I can reconstruct the shopping center, I'm not responsible in providing an area for my tenant to lease, right? That would have been an example of force majeure. Fast forward to March, and then all of a sudden the interpretation of force majeure maybe was a little bit different depending on whether you were a shopping center landlord or a tenant, when you have potentially local governments closing down businesses, right?
Well, this is 2020, so we're still have to all be ready for asteroids to fall on buildings. But yes, usually what we're worried about with regard to force majeure are changes in law, are unavailability of labor, unavailability of materials and supplies, and now we've got the civil authority issue where government is they're exercising their police powers, is where it falls constitutionally, and they are they're not allowing restaurants to open. They are, by the way, starting to loosen up, but they're not allowing places where folks gather. And so, by the way, the result for that, and I'm sure you discussed this with other people in real estate, was takeaway. Restaurants are becoming more takeaway in orientation. And actually, in the local real estate forum that you were one of the moderators of, you'll recall, there was a discussion there, and it ties to this factually. Restaurants have changed their model a little bit over time with things like takeaway services, Uber Eats, things like that. That they were becoming a little bit less seated entertainment facilities and more complex kitchens. So they were trending in that direction of having the skill set to do that. This has pushed it pushed it hard. I mean, my
Right.
family and I have a couple of restaurants we like. We haven't been to a sit-down restaurant in months, but we have gotten takeaway a couple of times, and some of them just in our area, you can't get inside. They've got almost a booth outside where you pay and they bring it out to you.
Right. And we've seen a bunch of that in the trends on, it's fascinating. Some restaurants, their revenue actually has gone up as a result of this because they were able
Not too
to
many.
quickly understand the change of the game and adapt. So going back to the commercial real estate sales, what areas should buyers pay special attention to during due diligence? And I'll kind of qualify this with, I was talking with a friend of mine who owns shopping centers and said, you know, one of the areas he wanted to really scrutinize was the rent roll and make sure
Mhm.
that some businesses weren't necessarily being propped up a little bit by the landlord that's selling the thing, and he's going to inherit a problem where 2 months after purchasing the shopping center, the tenant can't pay the rent. So,
Okay. John,
kind
who released one of my exam questions to you?
of,
Talking about the topic. But tenant mix is very important for purchasers of commercial properties, whether they're BOMA A, B, or C. So yeah, absolutely. Tenancy and co-location is very important, and that plays out on rent roll.
yeah. Have you seen where there's any issues with financing or any change to how, you know, banks are underwriting and going through that process?
Slower, a little bit slower. They were already having concerns starting, a way back with their
Hmm.
underwriting because they want to make sure that tenants are able to pay or purchaser or that the purchasers have the ability to repay loans. So I think they're looking a little harder at the economic standing long term of a borrower. Particularly where it's not an owner occupied property where they're,
Right.
or it's going to be built to suit or they're going to have tenants in there. So, looking at guarantors, looking at really, this is what you do. But you know that pro formas can be made to look like anything. But due diligence is one of the most important parts, really, of a transaction. And on that part, I think they're spending more time on their underwriting and loan committees to make
Yeah.
sure.
No, that makes a lot of sense. To shift kind of gears a little bit, and I think we touched on it a little bit about leasing. Have you noticed any new trends in leasing? We've kind of talked about contingencies, possibly force majeure, maybe being clarified a little bit. What else have you seen?
Tenants closing,
Tenants.
um, tenants closing, businesses closing. There's been, in our local community, there's been a number of businesses that have closed in the last week or two.
Mhm.
And, I've worked with clients as well who are trying to figure out, what was the song by The Clash, Do I Stay or Do I Go? And
Yeah.
trying to make sense if it makes financial sense to stay in a business, to stay in a property. And what are the implications to them if they don't? So flip side
Right.
is landlords, what do I do to retain clients? There's in the good days, there's really not a whole lot of motivation um, to continue to negotiate after a contract has been signed. But there's more of that workout mentality that's needed right now, where the
Yeah.
parties have to work together, and that plays out in a variety of different ways, right? It plays out perhaps loan terms extended, interest rates being adjusted. Same thing with leases. Perhaps base rent can be suspended, or even better, altogether forbearance and forgiven. But
Hmm.
with issues like operating expense, OPEX, CAM, and the pass-throughs, property
Right.
taxes, center insurance, and operating expense, those have to get met. But that puts stress, by the way, backwards onto the landlord, because unless they own a building, real estate, real property outright, then there's stress to them to make their mortgage payments. And there's stress on the banks because, people think banks are cold and heartless. They're not. They're businesses. Their job is to basically rent money, rent principal. And the rent that they get paid back, as I tell my students, is interest. And from that interest that they're paid, that's how they pay their operating expenses and how they repay their investors as well. So COVID, from the tenant all the way to the bank and the bank's investors, has created stress and is requiring flexibility and resilience among all the parties.
Right. And we've seen a good bit of that. I think, banks, to their credit, were very willing to work with borrowers, in providing some temporary deferrals on payments, which I think also allowed landlords to, I kind of took a quick straw poll of people I know, and most of them, if you communicated well as a tenant and say, hey, let's hold off on maybe some portion of the rent for some period of time, they were pretty amenable to that. I think, but there were unfortunately cases where, so a national restaurant that I like to frequent, they made headlines in April because they said nationwide they weren't going to pay any rent, and it was kind of a unilateral, we're a big company, we're just not going to pay rent. So what do landlords do in that event if you have a tenant, maybe it's a larger tenant, and they just tell you, hey, we're not paying rent?
That's where they negotiate. The landlords need to keep the physical property in good shape. So that may be where they do temporarily forgive or delay or spread out rent over a longer period, but continue to get paid the pass-throughs, because those have got to get paid to maintain the facility. Here's what we don't want. We've been around long enough to remember what happened in 2008, 2009. And there was at least one study I saw that said this could be far, far worse when the cork comes out of the dam. And the cork may be coming out because there were nationally and in Florida moratoria on evictions and foreclosures.
Right.
And they're still ongoing right now for a little bit with regard in the state of Florida with residential, and with federal with regard to federally sponsored residential. But commercial properties, evictions and foreclosures, they can go forward. The issue, and I do get to see this a little differently. Let me give a little backstory. One of the things is I'm president of the 8th Judicial Circuit Bar Association currently. That's our 6-county bar association. And as a result, I'm on some working committees, and one is the committee for the 8th Judicial Circuit to reopen the trial courts. Now, I'm predominantly a transaction person, but I still see that, and I also get the orders that come out, administrative orders come out of the Florida Supreme Court. Courts are opening up now in our circuits in Florida. They're starting to open up back to business. They're starting to move back to trials, and they're getting creative. They're doing online Zoom trials as well. So you have to look judicial circuit by judicial circuit, but our circuit is starting to reopen slowly and carefully, which means that there may be a bottleneck for a while, but at some point, landlords, lenders are going to start to file evictions and foreclosures again, certainly against commercial tenants, and it could be against residential. The Florida residential moratorium on evictions, it's not open-ended. It has to be, the reason one is not paying, it has to be COVID related, and it only applies to financial orders. So the final order, so the case can be started. You just can't pull the trigger with a order and writ of possession of the property. So we could be seeing that happen if, going back to your question, landlords and tenants aren't creative working together. But we know landlords have got to get paid. That's their business. They rent space and they borrow money to do it. Hopefully there will be creative people will get involved over time, just as you suggested, to come up with methods structurally working together, so that we don't end up with a wide flood of evictions and foreclosures, because then you're going to have a lot of REO property out there, and that's no good for the world. For sure.
So you bring up residential, so that's a good segue. So talking about residential, have you noticed any changes to residential real estate sales?
Um, well, my practice is a little bit more trended towards commercial. So when I do residential, there are, let's just say, there are custom deals. I do it when folks come to me because they know my work, and then they ask me to do it with them. So those are typically, as you said before, put together deals. But
Right.
The trend, and you may have heard this from some of your other folks you've spoken with, the trend is a good deal flow with regard to closers who do volume transactions. One of my colleagues out in our Melbourne office represents a couple of developers, and she's doing closings one after the other. What's the driver behind that? Interest rates are down, and they're going down.
Yeah.
People are refinancing or they're buying now because interest rates are, they're under 3% right now, I believe. I don't know if they're going to keep going down, but they're low. And that's a driver for producing residential deals. And it is.
Yeah, and that's something we've seen a ton of, is the residential market hasn't softened at all. In fact, prices are still increasing, and it kind of goes back to the interest rates are historically low. It's almost insane to think about what you're borrowing at today versus probably, Phil, when you bought your first house, what your interest rate was on that loan. I'm assuming it was much higher than the 2.25 or 2.5% that you see today.
But let's back up half a step there. Banks have still got to be careful so they don't end up back where they were in '08 and '09 and loaning money, even at low interest rates, to people who really aren't qualified to buy. They overbuy and then they get foreclosed.
Yeah, and hopefully that doesn't happen. And I think the whole world's kind of watching with a bated breath on what are foreclosures doing and what is this economic downturn look like compared to '08 when it primarily was housing driven. For the residential, have you noticed any trends or changes to leasing?
No, I have not. Not
No?
particularly. They seem to be. It seems to be just running the same issue as, do you have tenants who can pay? Now, I do observe it from an unusual angle. Okay, is I'm the parent of a child in college who has an apartment.
Okay.
And a lot of the universities have parent groups on Facebook, social media. And one of the discussions that I have seen numerous times is if universities are going online entirely, and UNC Chapel Hill just went all online. And the reason I know that is one of my friend's sons is the president of the student government, and he was interviewed on CNN this morning, so I was listening for my friend. But one of the issues that I've seen in some of the parent chat groups, and that's really the tenant for, some the kids live there, but the parents pay the rent, right? Mm-hmm. Is why do we have to do this? What can we do to get out of our leases? Can we get out of our leases? There's no reason for my kid to be renting an apartment now if their classes are online. They can take online classes anywhere. And I'm not going to go into the sociodynamics of education, but I have observed that is a conversation that happens quite a bit. And I suppose, having worked with mostly landlords, is, I'm sympathetic certainly to the parents, but landlords are businesses and people as well. Again, they've got financial pressures. They have staffs, they have loans themselves. So right now, the landlords that I've observed for the most part are saying, you're adults, you signed a lease, you got to keep renting the place.
Yeah, that's a theme, and I think student housing, that's another big question mark about that is the demand there that was there previously, and that's a big question when you do have students attending classes online or universities primarily going online. I know one of our partners.
And longitudinally, like we just talked about restaurants changing their business model to some degree. If universities change their business model and become more creatures of online education, what happens to apartment rentals? And by the way, if kids aren't here, what about the affiliated retail and restaurant that is encircles the university? And it's true. I mean, I teach at Warrington, in the Master of Science of Real Estate program, I teach the law of real estate transactions. And I've customarily taught it live, but they're videotaped because some students, they're grad students, have internships, and so they're out of town. This year, I'm a little old school. I didn't want to teach like this Zoom. I like to meander around a little bit and use the whiteboard. So I taught in a live classroom that was taped, completely empty.
Yeah.
So, you know, they got the same material, I suppose, a little less, perhaps a little less give and take in the course sessions, but that means no one, unless they happen to live in Gainesville, was in Gainesville, which means,
Right.
you know, they weren't necessarily renting apartments and they weren't going to restaurants at all or shopping retail or frankly, even buying gasoline. One of the funny stories is one of my friends told me the other day she hadn't bought gas since March. Well, I mean, it's funny to hear that, but businesses are going to, are currently slowed down a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a real thing. Just kind of to wrap up a little bit on the real estate, we talked about the evictions and the fact that there's a moratorium. Can the landlords do anything to protect themselves, or are they kind of at the mercy of waiting for that moratorium to be lifted?
Well, the statute right now says final orders, so they could be getting ready, working with their lawyers to file the cases. They just can't get to the actual evictions.
Okay.
But one of my concerns there has been, so they evict everybody from an apartment complex. One, they have to refill them.
Yeah.
Two is, now they've got a lot of tenants with credit dings, and they're probably, after they've evicted people, going to get other people who have credit dings because they've had to move out. So it's almost like interest rate swaps, isn't it? I mean, people are just moving from point A to point B to point A. And it will be interesting to see how that fills out. And I know another person you spoke with, who I like to get data from, is Bo Beery, and he was talking about with me yesterday. You know, he said he deals with multifamily units, apartment complexes, for example, about the different size units, different size developments. You know, some larger ones are selling, some smaller ones, where they break out in terms of percentages of sales. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time, and also the pricing of, for apartment complex owners, what that does.
Yeah. And just anecdotally, I know I've seen as I'm driving down the road, signs offering concessions, and so that's one of those indicators where, maybe they're trying to get to those leasing numbers that maybe in other years would have been pretty easy to get to. So it's just kind of an interesting sign. Well, that's about all the time we have today. So thank you, Phil, so much for all of your insights and wisdom. Really, truly appreciate your time. And thank you. If you haven't checked out the rest of our videos, go to our YouTube channel, and they're up there in the real estate section. And then be sure to check us out next time as we continue with more real estate insights. Thanks, guys.